طوفان در شهر ما. فریاد نیمه شب.
The literature on Iranian cinema of pre-revolutionary era has generally focused on studying Iran's alternative, or what is commonly known as the New Wave, and how this art house cinema, similar to Italian Neorealism, French New Wave, and Third Cinema, produced politically inclined and ideologically driven films. Such narratives tend to overlook the popular cinema industry that worked in parallel to the New Wave cinema and the productions of which at times overlapped with it. Regarded as cheap and imitative copies of Hollywood, Egyptian, and Hindi cinema, the productions of Iranian popular cinema, commonly and derogatively known as Film-Farsi or termed as Film-Farsi, have been largely shelved. While perceived as conforming to the nationalist logic of the Pahlavi state, Film-Farsi has also been dismissed for its escapist content, commercial allure, and capitalist mode. A closer reading of the films, as I will do in this presentation, reveals elements that made this industry popular among the working class and lower socioeconomic strata, and that also paved the way for the emergence of an oppositional alternative cinema in the 1960s. As a vernacular modernist cultural product, I show that Film-Farsi offered a critique of the everyday, particularly invoked through its complex relationship with its setting, the city, sometimes taken to be the capital, Tehran. By investigating a few films as windows into this cinema industry, I argue that by depicting the city and its degeneration in the form of an urban crisis, Film-Farsi flirted with social and political criticism, therefore offering dystopic national imaginations that were in contradiction to the national image of a modernizing Iran that the Pahlavi government propagated. There was a decade-long hiatus in commercial film production from the 1930s, the late 1930s to the late 1940s. The chaotic circumstances during World War II, the invasion of the Allied forces in 1941, the forced abdication of Reza Shah, foreign occupation, and post-war political disorders did not readily provide conditions needed for the production and commercial success of fictional films. With the end of the war and withdrawal of international forces, Iranian filmmakers embarked on crafting Persian language films again. With the nationalization of oil in 1951, under the leadership of Mossadegh and the subsequent CIA and British MI6 design coup, the country entered another phase of political upheaval, especially in urban areas, which consequently gave rise to more social anxiety. Despite the political circumstances of this time, however, the number of film productions and movie theaters grew in cities across the country. Many of the film productions of post-World War II were inspired by Hollywood crime dramas, thrillers, and film noir, which reflected the wartime and post-war anxieties, and at the same time summoned the concerns of a tumultuous decade in Iran. In these films, urban society was depicted as dark, shadowy, and charged with class and moral clashes, while rural lifestyles were portrayed as pristine and unscathed by greed. The post-World War II films of popular cinema therefore postulated, circulated, and archived dystopic imaginations of urban life that became central to the art house and alternative cinema that emerged as a coherent movement in the 1960s. Such dark imaginations of the city in both popular and art house cinema perhaps contributed to the brewing of political and revolutionary sentiments and activities that culminated in the 1979 revolution. While dominant readings of the political centered the state as the ultimate authority, following Warren Magnuson, one can see the city as the center of the political and urbanism as a way of life. In other words, the city can be viewed as an accumulation of everyday life practices, practices that could generate violence as far as violence could be defined as a matter of intimidation, degradation, exclusion, deprivation, and depredation. seeing the world as a city and seeing the world through the city, in the words of Magnussen, therefore opens up new political possibilities. This city-based political imaginary makes connections to issues of justice and injustice, government and self-government, and emancipation and oppression. In other words, making the city as the focus of political and cinematic analysis could perhaps provide a plausible explanation for the emergence of the city as the center of revolutionary activity in the years leading up to the revolution. After all, mass organization and collective actions in Iran's major cities contributed greatly to the cooperative force on the streets that overthrew the Pahlavi monarchy. From its beginning in the 19th century, cinema has had an intricate relationship with the city, where it was first invented and introduced to the public in different parts of the world. While cities served as backdrops for some films, they usually also carried political charge and ideological weight. In Iran, cinema's emergence was inevitably linked to the conditions of urban modernity and processes of urbanization. As cinema provided images of far-flung cities and cultures, it circulated images of modern life with its novelties, technologies, wars, and new social relations and norms, images that became standards against or according to which Iranian modern society was to be imagined. As cinema became more popular, its proliferation contributed to the urbanization and compartmentalization of the city, giving rise to districts that came to be recognized as entertainment districts or hubs for activism and critical thinking. And that's not to say much about films themselves, which facilitated the collapse of time and space and the transformation of the concrete into virtual, processes that were all characteristic of modernity. One can clearly see the intricate relationship between cinema and city in some of the first Persian language film productions of the 1930s, such as Haji Agha, the cinema actor, and Dokhtar Dor, which I will not get to here because it's outside the scope of the presentation, but I would be happy to comment on them during the question and answer period. However, to give you a general idea, the films of the 1930s had a more ambiguous attitude towards the city as a place of encounter, possibilities, and creativity. The films of post-World War II, on the other hand, increasingly tended to view the city in a more dystopic fashion. In literary contexts, dystopia refers to an imaginary place, and dystopic genre refers to works of fiction that transport the reader from the present to a future that might be. Gyan Prakash argues that while utopic texts in literary studies transport us to a future that indicts the present, the dystopic imagination places us in the terrifying world of the present to alert us of the dangers that the future could hold. In other words, the dystopic imagination is animated by a utopian desire. Taking this temporal shift in mind then, dystopic fictional film in post-World War II cinema worked as harbingers of a horrid future, pregnant with nostalgia for an imagined past. Around the mid-20th century, the legacy of wars, socio-political conflicts, the rise in consumerism and circulation of global commodity and cultural capital gave rise to the general notion that the moral stability of Iranian society was at risk, and with that, so was their physical well-being. In 1944, a few years after the Allied invasion, Nahid publication complained about the dangerous and insecure conditions seen on the streets of Tehran, where, for example, on Saadi Avenue alone, 13 cases of thefts had been reported in the past few months, one ending in the beheading of 1 or 2 people. So in the image that you see here, it's supposed to represent the last heist that ended in the beheading of 2 people, but they're also poking fun at the insecurity and the insecurity of basically Iranian Tehran streets during this time. Continuing the same traditions in the 1950s, cultural magazines such as Tehran Illustrated, Tehran Musawwar, and Cinema Star, Setare Sinema, were saturated with serial crime fictions or true stories of crimes and misdemeanors that had taken place in major cities of Iran and also around the globe. Alternatively, they featured reports about poverty and the downtrodden strata of society. In a 1959 article titled Tehran has now become too big, Dr. Nazarzadeh Kermani wrote about the dreadful consequences of World War II, including the creation of a sudden peculiar wealth gap, rapid unsettling of wealth balance, and the emergence of new money or nouveau riche in Tehran. In this new world, he stated, a group of nationless, seemingly Iranians, Irani Namaye Bivatan, saw an excellent opportunity to increase their own wealth at the expense of the well-being of their fellow compatriots, therefore leading to social and economic inequality in Tehran. Cinema was itself complicit in what was seen as the sociocultural disintegration of mid-20th century. Materialism and consumerism promoted through film, theaters, and its surrounding image culture were held responsible for the weakening of moral and mental certainty and stability. Movie theater spaces, according to Siraj Ansari in 1947, were places that fostered spatial corruption and images cultivated incurable personal and social ailments. In 1946, Manouchehr Alai also remarked that aspects of dancing, singing, and revelry portrayed on screen destroyed the foundations of religion and spirituality. These anxieties arising from modernity and exasperated by rapid urbanization and modernization also became the concern of many films of this period. In the words of David B. Clarke, this dystopian alter ego of modernity was a powerful, recurrent nightmare, and this nightmare was framed more forcefully in filmic representations of the city. Therefore, a strong sense of place became one of the signifying motifs of popular cinema. The city, emblematic of modern life with its utopic and dystopic traits, became central to these films as both the subject and setting. While Tehran, the capital, was sometimes depicted as a place of progress, modernization, creativity, and social mobility, with rapid urban changes, the urban became synonymous with uncontrollable population growth, youth unemployment, poverty, and moral decay. All of these issues became recurring themes in popular cinema. The horror or film noiresque crime dramas of Samuel Khachikian, such as Storm in Our City, released in 1958, in addition to other films such as The Midnight Scream, A Girl from Shiraz, with their images of violence and crisis of the soul, are perhaps best examples of films that express dystopic imaginations of the city in the 1950s. I'm just going to play a short clip from the beginning of the film Storm in Our City, Tufan dar Shahr Ma, which was released in the year 1958. Just to give you a sense of, this imagination of the city in its dark, shadowy image in Khachikian's films. This one is from Storm in Our City. I'm gonna stop it there. Storm in Our City tells the story of Simin, a beautiful woman who has lost her home and all her possessions in an earthquake in a provincial city. After relocating the family to Tehran, Simin's husband dies, leaving her with their mute child without any form of support. In a Tehran that is now home to a growing population of homeless people, she accidentally takes refuge with a psychiatric patient, the patient that you saw at the beginning of the film, who has fled from a mental asylum and who, having killed a man, is deemed as a very dangerous man. Simin and the patient, however, identifying with one another as members of an alienated class, develop an empathic friendship. In the absence of employment, Simin strolls down Lalezar Avenue to sell the last pieces of jewelry that has remained from her old life. It is here on Lalezar Avenue that she is harassed by a group of affluent university students, the so-called gigolos, who represent the decadence of an urban society that has fallen into the abyss of moral corruption. Saeed, an Etela'at newspaper reporter who is depicted as an honest and intellectual man, comes to the rescue of Simin, the damsel in distress, in this mad city. Sometimes shot in real urban locations, such as urban passages, streets, and sometimes in a studio, the city is depicted in its excess. And it is in the excess of urban life that individuals such as Simin or her daughter feel marginalized and at one point lost. I'm going to play another clip for you from the film. This is just before New Year's Eve, or it is actually New Year's Eve, and this is shot in a studio, but it's supposed to show the city in its excess. And it's in this city that Lale, basically Simin's daughter, mute child, gets lost in the city. In a dramatic form, Khachikian invoked a skeptical worldview towards the city that subverted the modern logic of order that the nationalist Pahlavi narratives aimed to promote. The Wild Angel, or Fereshteh Vahshi by Mehdi Rais Firuz, tells the story of Fereshteh, a newborn baby whose parents, unable to deal with the financial burden of bankruptcy in a merciless city, decide to commit suicide. Hoping that she would find a better life with another family, the parents leave Fereshteh in a quiet alleyway. However, just before they commit suicide, the parents have a last-minute change of heart and return to pick up Fereshteh from the alleyway, only to realize that she has disappeared. Fereshteh, who is adopted by a street sweeper, grows up to be a strong, beautiful woman with a tough attitude. Having been raised on the streets, she pickpockets to support herself financially, which is, of course, itself a very urban practice. One day in a huge fashion store, Fereshteh steals her biological mother's wallet and gets caught in the act. Of course, she doesn't know that this is her biological mother, but I should also note that the family, by this time, they have recovered from their financial hardship, and they, in fact, live a very bourgeois life, and they're still looking for their daughter. The mother, who realizes that Fereshteh has the same name as her lost daughter, takes pity on her, drops charges against her, forgives her offense, and instead makes her promise to never steal again. Honoring her promise, Fereshteh starts looking for a decent job in the ruthless city, but to no avail. In a male-dominated society, she repeatedly encounters men in power who, taking advantage of their position and her desperation, harass her in the workplace. The city in this film is not only merciless for its expensiveness and unaffordability, but for the opportunities that it fails to offer to a young single woman. And I'm going to play a short clip from this film, Fereshteh Vahshi, where this is one of the companies she goes to for an interview. She's seeking employment, of course, but the boss or the CEO, I'm assuming, basically makes a move on her. And my apologies that I don't have translation or subtitles for these, but I think the clip is very self-explanatory.
متشکرم. ولی منظورتون نمیفهمم. منظورم اینه که ما کارو با تفریح توام میکنیم که شما زیاد خسته نشید.
کارو با تفریح؟ ببخشید باز منظورتون نمیفهمم.
اتفاقا خیلی ساده حرف میزنم. خلاصه منظورم اینه که ما با هم علاوه بر کار یه تفریحات خصوصی هم داشته باشیم.
خیر آقای مدیر، اشتباه گرفتید. من اصلا کار نمیخوام.
So in this scene, images portraying Ferishta's anxiety as she goes from one office to another looking for a job, juxtaposed with images of modern, soulless, and somewhat identical buildings, speak volumes about the anxieties of modern life in a rapidly changing society. Ferishte and her boyfriend decide to pull off one last heist, targeting a house which ends up to be Ferishta's parents' home. Again, caught in the act, at the end of the film, the parents learn that Ferishte is the actual daughter that they had lost. Happy to have been reunited with their daughter, the parents offer to support Ferishte and her fiancé financially. Rais Firuz's city is therefore painted as a ruthless city. It is in this urban environment that one sees the decay of morality, and it is in the city where social inequality is most tangible. The anxieties of the 1950s grew even more with the development and industrial projects of the 1960s and 1970s. With the influx of oil money and industrialization, Iran witnessed a large inflow of people from rural areas into urban centers, especially Tehran, which had become a cosmopolitan hub of social and political importance. Reporting on these urban phenomena, in 1968, an article in Ferdowsi magazine blamed the overpopulation of cities for the trembling of the foundation of the family. The invasion of people to the cities, the article stated, led to selfishness, illnesses, and unbelief in civil laws, religious practices, and ancient traditions. Another author in the same year blamed the recklessness of West-toxicated engineers and urban planners for the erasure of the historical life of our cities, histories that were sacrificed for the building of wide streets, erection of aluminum buildings, colorful fountains, and landscaping. I'm going to come back to this historical erasure later on. With the migration of people from rural to urban areas, the overpopulation of cities and insufficient urban infrastructure and facilities, new social and cultural problems arose. Reporting on one of these problems, a 1959 article in Tehran Illustrated attended to the paralyzing increase in city rents. Calling it a catastrophe, the article took issue with how rents were determined based on the salaries and financial capabilities of a few rich foreigners and Iranian double citizens. Rather, the article argued apartment, house, and room rents must be calculated based on the income of average Iranian white-collar and blue-collar workers. Other articles poked fun at the incompatibility of rural and urban social norms and etiquettes. These issues also became common themes in popular cinema made from the 1950s to 1970s. These films usually portrayed a pure and naive picture of country folks and romanticized life in rural parts, in contrast to the cruel and unpleasant urban life. The urban was the site where Persian mythical values of righteousness and generosity were destroyed by global materialism and individualistic hedonism. Dariush Merjoui's آقای هالو made in 1971 is perhaps one of the films that a lot of people know that speaks directly to this incompatibility of rural customs and urban practices. But similar themes, in fact, appeared in popular cinema as early as early 1950s. For example, دختر چوپان, made in 1953 by Mu'izz Divan Fikri or Mu'izz Divan Fikri, revolves around the story of Ziba and Ahmad, a young woman and man who are in love with one another in a village. Ahmad's father, the village chief, does not approve of the union since he wants Ahmad to marry into a rich family. Disappointed by the news, Ziba moves to Tehran. And let me just play a short clip from this section when Ziba moves to Tehran to see how the director basically portrays this migration from the rural area to Tehran and basically what it shows as the Tehran of the time. Here, the film, of course, as you can see here, features a long scene to introduce the viewer and the female protagonist, Ziba, who's a newcomer, to the city. The film depicts the area around the artillery roundabout, Meydan Tubkhane, and streets and buildings in its vicinity. Buildings and monuments that perhaps filled Ziba with awe and terror at the same time. These scenes arguably ground the setting of the film in the city and allow urban experiences to make up the narrative. In Tehran, Ziba is shown to embarrass herself with her village attitude and customs. But with the help of an affluent urban philanthropist, she gains an education and turns into a city girl, at least only in appearance, as you can see in the image below. Ahmad, who is still in love with Ziba, sets out to look for her in Tehran, and with some good luck, he finally finds her. Unable to fit in a cruel city, the couple, now reunited, move to their village and start their life together there. To give you another example, Saeed Neyvandi's Eve's Daughters, or دختران حوا, attends to issues of overpopulation in Tehran and its associated problems such as overpriced and overcrammed apartment buildings. At the beginning of the film, a voiceover accompanies panoramic shots of the bride of Iranian cities, Tehran, and describes the setting of the film. I'm going to play you this scene from the beginning of the film, and it's very self-explanatory. I think you can get the...
عروس شهرهای ایران در دامنه سرسبز و مصفای کوهستان البرز تهران، این شهر بزرگ و افسانه‌ای با زیبایی خیره کننده خود به چشم می‌خورد. این شهر زیبا و رویایی با میدان‌های وسیع، خیابان‌های عریض و ساختمان‌های مدرن و خیال‌انگیز خود مردم ولایات را بی خود می‌کشاند. مردم شهرستان‌ها و دهات هر روز کار و فعالیت خود را رهایید دست یافتن به کار بهتر و درآمد و آسایش بیشتر به تهران هجوم می‌آورند. روزانه صدها نفر به وسایل مختلف خود را به این شهر بزرگ می‌رسانند تا شاید کسب و کار بهتری نصیبشان شود. نتیجه این بیفکری و تراکم جمعیت به آنجا می‌رسد که امروز حتی ایجاد ساختمان‌های عظیم و خانه‌های نوبنیاد نیز کفاف زندگی آنها را نمی‌دهد و در نتیجه اشکالات عظیمی تولید می‌شود که در آن میان مشکل مسکن و کرایه خانه بیش از هر چیز جلب توجه می‌کند و با تمام کوشش و مراقبتی که در امر آسایش و راحت مردم مخصوصاً تهیه مسکن به کار می‌رود، هجوم اهالی و جمعیت روزافزون شهر بر مشکلات کار می‌افزاید و در نتیجه ایجاد مسکن و تهیه خانه همچنان به صورت دیو مهیبی خودنمایی می‌کند. کمبود خانه و کرایه سرسام‌آور آن باعث می‌شود تا مردم اغلب در خانه‌هایی زندگی کنند که در هر گوشه آن افرادی با اخلاق و خصوصیات جداگانه به سر میبرند و این امر در زندگی این چنین کرایه نشین‌ها گاه تولید ماجراهای خنده‌آوری می‌کند که موضوع فیلم امشب ما نیز شرح یکی از همین.
So the story revolves around the interconnected lives of a group of tenants in a building. The film depicts the conflicts between old and young generations, rural and urban lifestyles, traditional and new social norms, and the ways the tenants themselves created means to solve problems stemming from urbanization, especially in the absence of order and an effective governing institution. I have some other examples, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip those examples, but I can talk about them later on if you want. For example, films such as Fear and Hope. There are other films such as A Girl from Shiraz, The Local Gallant Jahil Mahal, The Paupers of Tehran, Gedayan Tehran, which all include aerial and panning shots of Tehran featuring landmarks such as the Artillery Roundabout, Meydan Tubkhane, Moulin Rouge Cinema, and Lalezar Avenue, and of course, Hotel Lalezar. Film and movie theaters are spaces that themselves constitute an urban culture and identity. In their dark depictions of the urban, city-centered films engendered nostalgia for an unsophisticated past that no longer was. In other words, many films from the 1950s to 1970s invoked sensibilities and motifs that gave films a particularly Iranian color. These cultural products spoke to the concerns that cultural critics had in regard to the historical erasure that was enabled by urbanization. I already mentioned a few cultural critics, for example, in 1950s, who talked about this erasure of the history of city through urbanization. As such, the films featured symbolic motifs and visual tropes revolving around traditions and practices that they observed to be disappearing and forgotten in the urban. The Zurkhane, House of Strength, traditional coffee houses, and the practice of Naqali storytelling, minster music performances, and religious symbols that represented everyday religiosity were some of the motifs that were embedded and therefore archived in both popular and alternative films. The Zurkhane, or House of Strength, a gym where athletes performed Iran's ancient sport, Varzish Bastani, for example, was a particularly repeated visual motif in many popular films. For example, in Dokhtar Chupan, the shepherd girl that I already talked about and I showed you a clip from the film, it embedded this visual trope that many other films after it also began to highlight as well. The film features long shots of a real Zurkhane and the practices of real athletes in that space that do not necessarily relate to the narrative of the film. While the city drives the plot of the film, Zurkhane becomes an intrinsic element of the imagined city. Just to show you, give you an example, this is the clip in the film Dokhtar Chupan, which is really unrelated to the narrative, but the filmmaker thought it must be included in the film. So these scenes were deemed so significant to the film that the announcement for the film, in fact, highlighted its depiction of Iran's ancient sport performed by the country's champions, قهرمان کشور. Interestingly, while newspaper announcements boasted of such scenes of Zurkhane, the reviews of the film, penned by cosmopolitan-minded film critics who encouraged the creation of a social realist art house cinema, entertained a different opinion. Writer and film critic Farhad Foroughi believed that The Shepherd Girl was devoid of any artistic and social value or realist aspect, and was therefore nothing but a fantasy. The author took issue with the unrealistic nature of the plot, the dialogues, the acting of some of the artists, and especially scenes from a Zurkhane in the south of Tehran, where ancient sports were performed by some ugly and misshapen behemoths who were proud of their championship titles. In a snobby comment, Foroughi rebuked the film's opening shots of Tehran's streets and giant buildings, which in the opinion of the author could have only been to the benefit of those who had not seen Tehran or who had recently moved to the city. Scenes that he said should have been purchased by the Ministry of Roads for its archives. And I wish they had done that, but they didn't. South of the City, or Competition in the City, is another film. In fact, a film that blurs the lines between Film-Farsi and alternative film, but it draws on this trope of Zurkhane significantly. Set in traditional neighborhoods in the south of Tehran, the film features Persian percussion music, or zarbi, as the background score. The rhythmic beats of tombak played at the beginning and throughout the film, which conveys a sense of apprehension and foreshadows ominous events, also resembles the sound and feel of Zurkhane, a motif that is repeated throughout the film itself. The setting of the film also has a very distinct urban feel. In fact, the shots in the beginning of the film show northern Tehran, which are then juxtaposed in stark contrast to later scenes from southern and impoverished parts of the city. I'll show you, this is the last clip I have, and then I'll conclude.
راستی
Popular cinema ordained a continuous unveiling of chaotic social relations and registered Iran's processes of self-invention and modernization through its vernacular offerings. By placing the city as the subject and setting, Film-Farsi portrayed the experience of modernity in its contradictory layers, offering alternative narratives to the official discourse of the Pahlavi government. The anxiety of the social conditions of Iran, the fear and terror of what could be, found expression in filmmakers' portrayal of urban decadence or nostalgia for an imagined moral society. The dark representations of the city in these films worked as a means of urban criticism. These films depicted how oppression punctuated the drama of freedom on the streets of Tehran. The dystopic form following Gyan Prakash, in fact, functioned as a critical discourse that embraced urban modernity rather than rejecting it. On the other hand, salvage from the dystopic form of the city, the films suggested, could be found in a nostalgic return to traditional, cultural, and at times religious norms and values. The recurring motifs of Zurkhane, local shrines, images of Shiite saints and qahwekhanes evoked everyday religiosity and traditional Persian attributes of chivalry and honor that were also repeatedly invoked in literary and artistic traditions. Despite vociferations against these visual motifs by film critics, the same themes and tropes were later adopted by new wave or alternative filmmakers in their social realist films that were more politically and ideologically charged. Filming in the city therefore lent realism to these productions and allowed filmmakers to engage with an urban crisis, which later emerged in the form of street protest and urban dissent before the 1979 revolution. Thank you for your attention.